Hey everybody, welcome back. I just want to talk for a few minutes about discussion questions. Um, as you may have noticed on the syllabus, up until this point, you've just been getting full credit for discussion questions if you hand them in on time. And that's going to change starting February 26th. We're going to start assigning grades based on the quality of your questions. So how we know what the quality of the questions is based on the feedback that I'm giving you. And it's also based on some of the suggestions I'm going to make in this video. And just as an FYI, I also posted a short document, a short guide that kind of outlines a lot of the ideas I'm going to talk about in this video and that you may find helpful. That guide is called On Discussion Questions. I think I posted it with a slightly different title. It was like Discussion Question Tips, but I'm going to post it right alongside this video, and I can email it out to everybody as well. So you'll be sure to have a copy of it. Whatever it's called on Moodle, here are some of the suggestions that I make in that guide. Okay, these are things that you should keep in mind as you're writing your questions, and these are things that I'm going to be looking for you to be trying to raise in your questions. Okay, one, and this is always the most important thing that we talk about as historians. What is the significance of a given source or a given problem, given issue, right? What can reading a certain Confederate soldier's letter to his cousin tell us? What can it not tell us, right? How much can we actually learn from a given source? And what is it that we might actually be able to learn from a given source, right? Those are all questions about the significance of a source. Are there connections between the documents, right? I always like to see folks who pose questions that are about multiple documents at the same time. And you should always, always, always be asking about more than one document in both of your questions, right? And let me say that a little more clearly. Don't write two questions about just one source, right? If you're going to read 8 sources in a week, plus everything we've read in earlier weeks, plus lecture, plus discussions, you have all that material at your fingertips, you should not just be writing 2 discussion questions about a single source, okay? So certainly always at least try to touch on at least 2 sources in your questions, but in a best case scenario, each question is going to try to address multiple sources, okay? So that means of your 2 discussion questions in a week, you might be touching on 4, 5 different sources. That's great, right? That shows you're really reading, that shows you're really thinking about connections between things. Consider the intended audience. Quite a few of you are doing this already and doing a really good job of asking these kinds of questions. But really, you know, this is about asking who is an author trying to reach? How might that intended audience affect what the author says, what the author writes, what the author doesn't say? Right, you're trying to interrogate the source. Okay, not just the words on the page, but the source itself. What is the difference between a speech and a personal letter home? What's the difference between a short piece that's going to be published in someone's hometown newspaper versus a book that's published, right? Like we read George Fitzhugh. George Fitzhugh was writing from a book. He was trying to publish to a very wide audience. How might that affect some of the conclusions he makes, some of the things that he says? So considering the intended audience is a way to really interrogate the whole source and not just, I read these words on the page, they must mean this or that. And that's all another way of saying think beyond the document's borders, right? Think about more than just the words on the page. Explore the premises of a piece, right? Is there something implicit? Is there something understated in the document that you think is important for understanding it? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this means in just a second when I give you some examples. But just, again, exploring really what the basic context of a source is. Okay. Some things I would like you to avoid. Don't ask recall-oriented questions. I really haven't seen much of this this semester, so I think you're doing well. But the purpose of these questions is not for you to quiz your classmates, right? On page 56, what did J.D.B. Du Bois say about non-slaveholding whites, right? That's not what we're here to do. Your job here is to encourage them to go back to the sources and analyze them, to read them a little more carefully, to ask questions of them. Don't ask factual details that your classmates can't reasonably provide an answer for. You can always ask me those questions. You can post those questions on the forum. You don't just have to post your discussion questions, right? If you have a question about popular support for the Confederacy throughout the South, your group is probably not in a position to answer that, but I am. So you can say, here are my 2 discussion questions. Also, Pat, what do you make of this problem? Can you help us figure this out? I'd be more than happy to do that. I would be delighted to do that. And then avoid normative questions. Again, I think folks are doing relatively well with this. What a normative question is a question that assumes that our values, right, 21st century Montanan college student or college teacher values are normal, and they extend all the way across human history, which as history students we all know is not the case, that people in the 19th century thought very differently than we do. They experienced life in a way that was different than we do. And they had experiences that none of us can ever have, including living through the American Civil War. So it's not fair for us to just put our values necessarily onto them. That doesn't mean we don't judge them. That doesn't mean we don't hold up a critical eye to them. But it does mean that we want to try to understand their experiences instead of just holding them up to our values and seeing how they measure up. Okay. So I've got a couple of questions to show you that I think are examples of some of the things that I'm talking about here. So this first one, I think this is a really good question. Let's see here. So you can read through it if you'd like. I'll just read it really quickly. Southern slaveholder George Fitzhugh, and then we have a little page citation, explains how Southern society is prosperous and desirable, while Northern abolitionist Ralph Waldo Emerson attacks Southern society as backwards and oppressive. Why might Emerson's evaluation of Southern society differ from Fitzhugh's? What do these 2 documents tell us about the divide between how slaveholders and abolitionists viewed slave society before the Civil War? Okay, there's a few things I really like about this question. One, most simply, it's asking about more than one document. It's a comparative question. Fantastic. 2, also, this is very basic, very simple, but very important. It gives us page numbers, right? And 3, last really basic, simple thing, it attributes perspective to individual authors. It doesn't just say the South, the North, or it doesn't say in the book we read, right? It's very specific. This is Fitzhugh's perspective. This is Emerson's perspective. Excellent. Other things I really like. It asks about authors' motivations. Okay, what is their intention? What are they trying to do? So it's asking us to think critically about those authors, which means we have to go back to the source. We have to read a little more carefully. Excellent. So that is a very good question, a good example of what I'm looking for. Let's check out another one, example 2 here. Okay, here we go. On pages 35 and 36, George Fitzhugh describes the South like a paradise that is free from vice, crime, and inequality. How accurate do you think his descriptions are? Does his bias invalidate what he writes? This is an awesome and simple question, okay? It's super open-ended. It doesn't ask us to go beyond the source. It just asks us to revisit Fitzhugh and say, oh yeah, wait, what actually did we just read? Because we can't take him necessarily at his word. He's obviously biased, but does that actually invalidate what he writes? Really, really good stuff. What is this doing? It's challenging the premise of the source. Fitzhugh's premise is the South is a paradise. Fitzhugh's premise is slavery is a social good. Freedom and equality are social evils, right? Those are his basic premises. Instead of just taking him at his word or just saying, this guy's full of it, I don't care what he has to say, it's challenging that premise. How did he come to that conclusion? Why is he saying these things? What's he trying to do? It's very good. It's a question that's asking us about the strategy behind the document. Again, incredibly open-ended question. This is not like asking you to say, what did Fitzhugh say on page 39? It's asking you to really think about the document. And I also really like that this is a super clear and simple question. Some of you have written amazing questions that are like 400 words long with all kinds of background information about the source. That's great. It's really good effort. I so appreciate that. I think it's really cool to see you really digging into the source that way, but you don't always have to do that. If you want to write a source that's, or sorry, if you want to write a question that's, 50 words long, short and sweet, but is really good, like this one, have at it. That can be really powerful. Question 3. This is a more recent one. In his letter, Charles Harvey Brewster expresses frustration that many Union officers seem more interested in returning escaped slaves than in fighting to preserve slavery. It seems obvious from this statement that he is concerned with keeping the South in the Union, but when he talks about escaped slaves, do you think he sounds sympathetic to their plight or not? What do you think Brewster's attitude towards escaped slaves and preserving the Union say about the reasons some Northern soldiers fought against the South? I gotta say, I chose this question because I liked it, and as I read it, I like it even more. That Brewster document is pretty odd and it's pretty challenging because I think we tend to think about the Union's role in the Civil War as it's an abolitionist army. Of course, these guys hated slavery. Of course, these guys were on the right side of history. But the Brewster document's complex because he really does despise the pro-slavery cause. He really is angry that Union soldiers are returning enslaved people to their masters. And he's also a virulent racist. Okay, and Brewster's life story is super interesting. He's actually from my hometown, and he becomes intimately familiar with many enslaved people throughout the war, and he really captures just how complex this whole experience was for Northern soldiers. But it's hard to say exactly what to make of that piece, and this question is really capturing that. But it's asking us, among other things, to discuss some really big issues based on limited evidence, which is what we're doing in this class. We could read 10,000 soldier letters, but it's going to take us a little while. So if we read this one, what can we say about Northern soldiers fighting against the South? Based on just what we read here, are there any conclusions that we can draw? Right? This is a really smart question, really nicely done. And also, again, cites the page number that they're talking about. This is especially important if you quote the piece, but it's really nice to see folks doing it even when they're not explicitly quoting the piece. Okay, just a couple of quick things to avoid. Here's this question. Slavery was called less productive on page 37. How does the proof listed above make slavery less productive in the South? I feel like slavery and employment is almost misinterpreted during this section. Would some agree? I have a couple issues with this question. One, it's kind of vague. I don't really know exactly what this person's asking. I didn't really understand what it meant, what they meant by almost misinterpreted during this section. So this is a chance where you can use specific evidence that you read to help the group understand what you're asking, right? So if we go back here, we're citing specifically, this is what Charles Harvey Brewster said, right? We go back here, this is what George Fitzhugh said. So here, I'm a little confused. What exactly do you mean? What exactly are you talking about? So be specific. And then name the author and the source. And then I think a sort of leading question at the end, like would some agree, doesn't quite help us enough. Grab onto what it is you're asking us to do. And why does, I guess what I would ask there is, why does it matter if we agree or not? Is there something more specific that you can ask? Okay, another one. John H. Cochran writes home that he believes secession is the only way to protect slaveholders, and he would rather see the land drenched in blood than be submissive to the North or those trying to prevent secession. Is Cochran conveying a popular sentiment of this time? This is like very nearly a really good question. There's a really good reliance on the source. There's a very effective summary of Cochran's argument. My only challenge to it is, one, as the question is framed, we can't answer it, right? Is he conveying a popular sentiment of the time? None of us know. We didn't read enough source material to say. This is a good example where if you wanted to say, hey, Pat, is this guy just sort of talking out of left field, or is he conveying a popular sentiment? Could you help us understand this? That's where I can weigh in specifically. And by the way, I would say, yeah, depending on the region of South that we're talking about. But yeah, that's a fairly popular sentiment. One that's become, that's stayed quite popular, in fact, for much of the history since the Civil War. So try to give us a slightly more open-ended framing in a case like this. So I gave you some examples here. Something like, what might Cochran's letter illustrate about average Southerners' perspectives before the war? Are there limits to his perspective we should be aware of? To what extent do we think Cochran is conveying a popular sentiment? Is there enough evidence in this week's sources to help us answer that? Something like that, okay? So that's all I've got for now with those. My last suggestion, always write more than you need. If you're reading 6 to 8, I think about 6 to 8 is the normal number of primary sources that we read in a week. If you're reading that much, you should have at least one question about each source. And then you should start trying to write comparative questions between them. Give yourself time to revise your questions. Okay, let it take a little while. Make sure you're being clear. Make sure you're expressing yourself in a way your classmates are going to understand. And then choose the best questions. Okay, don't just write 2 and then just go with what you have because it's all you have. Okay, as always, you can ask me any questions that you have. I'd be delighted to talk more about this with any of you. And I'm looking forward to seeing your questions in the next few weeks. Thanks, everybody.